Hello and welcome to the inaugural episode of Ask Your Representative, the show where voters can pose their pressing questions to their elected officials. My name is Trevor Wynn and I'm the Business and Marketing Librarian at the Clarkson Independence District Library. Today we're pleased to welcome Representative Elissa Slotkin. Representative Slotkin, a Democrat from Holly, was elected in November 2018 to represent Michigan's 8th Congressional District, which covers parts of Lansing and East Lansing, northern Oakland County, and parts of Livingston County. Prior to her election to Congress, Representative Slotkin held positions in the CIA, the National Security Council, and the U.S. Department of State. Representative Slotkin, welcome to Clarkson High School in Independence Township. We're happy to have you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Right on. Well, we're going to jump right in. We have our first question. It comes from Lee, and he's from Howell, who has a concern regarding the impeachment inquiry.
Mm-hmm. Hello, Representative Slotkin. My name is Lee Posley. I live in Howell, Michigan. My question for you is actually more of a concern. I'm very concerned that the House of Representatives is spending so much time and energy in these impeachment proceedings when they know that once they turn it over to the Senate and for trial, that the Senate has to approve an indictment by a 2/3 majority, and that'll never happen with a Republican-controlled Senate. So why is the House, when they know this, why are they spending all this time and energy? And what's happening with government on a day-to-day basis when they're doing this? Thank you.
Sure. So listen, I'm the last person who wanted to have us in an impeachment inquiry. I did not make this decision lightly for the very same reasons that Lee flags. But at a certain point, that very basic idea that the President of the United States reached out to a foreigner and asked for information on an American, on a political rival, that to me crossed a line. And so I felt I had to come out and say something about it. Now, it is true that the committees of jurisdiction are doing their work. And for me, I'm not on those committees. So that's not what I'm going to be spending my time on. Mm-hmm. It's not what I'm watching minute to minute. What I'm focused on are the things that the district wants me to be doing, which is namely the price of healthcare, the price of prescription drugs, and clean water, and returning a sense of civility and decency to politics. So the big thing that we're working on right now in terms of the day-to-day of government is we just put forward our big prescription drug pricing bill. And the biggest things that this bill does, which are very bipartisan, they're things that the president has said, things that Democrats have said, are allowing Medicare to negotiate for drug prices, right? So that the prices are in bulk and lower, and then indexing our prices so that they're the average of what they're sold at around the world, so that someone here in Michigan isn't paying double or triple what they pay in Canada. It's indexed. So that's what I'm spending my time on. It's very bipartisan, right? Prescription drug pricing is something that crosses the aisle, and therefore it's going to need a really, really big push, and that's what I'm going to be spending my time on.
So I'm sure there are some constituents wondering the chances of that actually passing. I mean, it's been sort of difficult to get some legislation through Congress.
Yeah.
What are the prospects for that in 2020 for your constituents who are concerned about that?
So we actually have been moving a ton of legislation through the U.S. Congress. We've passed over 600 bills since I was sworn in January, but less than a dozen of those have been picked up by the Senate.
Wow.
So the bottleneck tends to be at the Senate level right now. They're not passing a ton of legislation or even holding it up for a vote, because I'm the first one to acknowledge that the House is Democratic right now, the Senate is Republican. So we know a lot of the bills that the House passes are not going to be voted in by the Senate. I just want them to have an up or down vote, right? I just want the machinery of government to work. The good news is on prescription drug pricing is one of those few issues where Democrats and Republicans really are saying the same thing, from the president to Speaker Pelosi to everyone down underneath it. And it's been crafted as something that was meant to be bipartisan. So instead of one party crafting a bill and kind of forcing the other party to look at it, this was built to be bipartisan. And there's a lot of senators who really want to pass prescription drug pricing legislation. A lot of senators who are up for re-election, both Democrat and Republican. So I still have faith that if we work hard and if the American public makes their voices heard, this will be voted on in the next month in the House, and then we got to get the Senate to pick it up.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you. So our next question, it comes from Jerome. He's from Rochester Hills, and Jerome is concerned about the security of our elections.
Good afternoon, Representative Slotkin. My name is Jerome, and I'm a resident of Rochester Hills. I appreciated your service and the service that you continue to do for the state of Michigan and for our district. My question is one of cyber terrorism. Can you inform us as your constituents what, if anything, could be done to prevent cyber terrorism and ensure that we have elections that are not interfered with by foreign powers? Thank you again.
Sure. So obviously, anyone who's loves this country and wants our democracy wants election security. We all want that, regardless of political party. And the good news is the House did pass a bunch of bills very early on in sort of February and March timeframe under a bill called H.R. 1 that called for increased resources to states on election security. In Michigan, we tend to be pretty well off because we have a paper ballot. So no matter what, when those machines read your ballot, there's always a paper copy. So that if we ever had a question about what kind of went on was there a cyber intrusion, we could always verify our voting here in Michigan, and we have a wonderful Secretary of State who knows how to do this kind of stuff. The other piece of good news is that Senator McConnell in the Senate passed an appropriation bill that gave an extra $250 million for election security. So again, a bipartisan approach to this issue. And that to me is going to help us. That said, there's no doubt that we need to be watching this like a hawk because warfare is changing. And whereas 30, 40, 50 years ago, it might be tank on tank or plane on plane, it is now cyber intrusion on cyber intrusion. And frankly, our governments, local governments, and our businesses are on the front line in a very, very different way than they ever were. So this is definitely an issue to watch.
All right, our next question. Our next question comes from Kevin, and he's from Lake Orion, and he has a question about the Senate.
Hi, my name's Kevin Church from Orion Township, and I have a question for Congresswoman Slotkin. I was wondering if there's anything that we could do to move Mitch McConnell on some of the legislation that's been passed in the House and is now just sitting and lingering in the Senate. Thank you very much.
Yes, there's a lot of bills. There's everything from, like we said, more election security, campaign finance reform. I mean, there is no way anyone feels good about money in politics right now. And for me, the system just isn't working the way our founders wanted it to work. So campaign finance reform, limiting the amount of money that can be spent in our elections, making sure we know if you're donating to a big super PAC, we know your name, so we know who you are. These are the kinds of things that I'm a big believer in and are on his desk right now. There's universal background checks and closing loopholes. I think whether you're a law-abiding gun owner or not, everyone, I think, understands, if you're going to buy a weapon at Dunham's, you're going to go through a background check. If you're going to buy a weapon off the internet, you should go through the same background check. There's a lot of things that are on his desk, over 600 bills.
Wow.
And the way that people can get engaged is writing their senators. Okay. Senator Stabenow and Senator Peters are obviously interested in passing legislation as well, but the more they hear from the public that they want, the public wants them to go to Senator McConnell, maybe grab him in the cafeteria and say, hello, let's get voting. The more they hear that, the better it'll be.
Okay. Our next question comes from Nicholas, who is a student at the Clarkston Junior High.
Hi, I'm Nicholas from Clarkston Junior High School. How do you feel about the tariff on imported goods from China? How do you feel about the president's take on climate change?
Sure, so two very different issues, and I love that it's from a middle schooler. Yep. That makes me even happier to answer the question. So on tariffs, I don't think anyone disagrees with the president's instinct to push back on China. I think it's very, very clear that China has been cheating when it comes to trade, stealing intellectual property, flooding international markets with goods that are subpar. And I think that instinct that the president had to really push back on China is a natural one. I just think that some of the tariffs that he's imposed and then the retaliation that came from the Chinese, it's kind of like the cure is worse than the original disease. And here in Michigan, we are being specifically targeted. Everyone from our soybean farmers who have have lived now through a couple of years of real instability on where are they going to sell their soy, to our fruit growers who are looking at a real difficulty getting their fruit to market with all these tariffs are auto suppliers. I mean, that's where I hear it the most, is in the supply chain on automobiles. And to me, I understand the instinct. I just don't want the American economy hurt by our retaliatory action. On climate change, I have to say that I think that the environment is one of the most bipartisan issues that I work on, particularly when we're talking about our local environment, our local watershed, clean water, our rivers, our lakes, our natural environment. Most of us in Michigan choose to live either in a beautiful, more sort of rural or suburban place, or we maybe go up north from time to time to experience that life. And so I think there's a lot of bipartisan support around the environment. That said, I am a believer in science. I am a believer that climate change is a real thing. I come at it from a national security perspective. I was at the Pentagon. We did the first study of how climate change would affect the military, our bases, our ranges. I flew and did a bunch of trips up to the Arctic under my Pentagon job because with all the melting ice up there, the Russians are more active in the Arctic. So it's a national security issue for me, and I think for everybody, and we need to treat it as such. And for people who maybe don't believe climate change is real, again, I would go back to what the military does. We do contingency planning. Even if something only has a 10% likelihood of actually happening, the military has plans and runs drills and exercises to understand. And that's, I think, just prudent planning that we need to be doing here in Michigan.
Thank you. You mentioned a little bit earlier about gun safety, but we have a couple questions from a couple voters related to gun policy. First, we have Lindsay, who's also a student at the Clarkston Junior High, and then we have Connie, who's a member of Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense.
What is your stance on arming teachers with guns to protect students in life-threatening situations?
My name is Connie. I live in Rochester Hills and I'm a member of Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense. And I'd like to know, Elissa, what Congress is doing right now regarding laws to restrict the sale of guns to domestic abusers, to people with mental health issues who shouldn't have guns, and the red flag laws is specifically what we're interested in knowing about.
On the last question first, on red flag laws, so these are the type of laws that are being explored state by state, and now are being discussed at the federal level. When someone is being really open that they want to hurt themselves or they want to hurt others, most states don't have laws where someone could bring that to law enforcement. They meet a very certain law and order legal threshold, and then the law enforcement would be able to remove a weapon from their home. And honestly, this issue hits home for me because I'm in an Army family. My husband was 30 years in the Army. The veteran community and suicide, it's an epidemic. And oftentimes we know that veterans want to harm themselves. We know that they have access to a weapon. They are trained on a weapon. And we can't do anything to help them, and they end up committing suicide. So I'm supportive of looking at these types of laws. We haven't seen the exact language, but at the federal level, I'm very open to looking at them. And I know Michigan is doing the same thing in Lansing. On arming teachers, so when I did 3 tours in Iraq alongside the military, I carried a Glock, so a handgun, and an M4, a semi-automatic. And what I always try to explain to people is, you learn to shoot first, and of course I grew up shooting guns. We're a gun-owning family from Holly. When you learn to shoot, you're just shooting at a target or at a tree, at a bird. That's one thing, right? You can learn and actually become quite good and quite adept at hitting your target. It's a whole different thing when there's shots being fired, there's adrenaline flowing, when an environment is chaotic, when people are screaming. The first thing that goes is your dexterity, right? Your ability to focus and your ability to do very specific tasks. So when I think about the idea of arming teachers, to me, for someone who's not familiar with that kind of level of training and like adrenaline, it makes me feel very nervous. I think that is not something that makes sense for every teacher. And I think just based on my experience of training with the CIA, I can't support someone who's really not familiar with a weapon, who has only the most basic couple of days of training, then having a weapon in a classroom and being asked to use it in a really intense, adrenaline-filled situation.
Right. Great. Really appreciate
Of course.
your time today. That's all the time we have, and we'll see you soon out in the district.
Great. Thanks so much.
We again want to thank Representative Slotkin for joining us today to answer questions from our community. If you have a question for the Congresswoman, you can visit her website at slotkin.house.gov/contact to send an email, or call her Washington, D.C. office at area code 202-225-4872. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on Ask Your Representative.